everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I am back to talk through all of the books that I read in Jane Austen July. This July was an amazing reading month for me. I am firmly out of my reading slump, so I cannot wait to talk to you about all of the books that I read. However, I have to point out that I am here once again in my Henry Tilney t-shirt, which you can possibly purchase on Inkwell Threads. That's where it came from, and that's where a lot of my bookish t-shirts came from. But I had to wear this particular shirt because prompt number 1 was to read one of Austen's main 6 novels. So I followed along with the group read for this year, which was Northanger Abbey. And I really enjoyed it. I haven't reread it in many years, and I really loved it, especially now that I have studied the trajectory of Gothic literature and was able to pick up on all of those little pieces. I also feel like it becomes funnier as you get older because you've now grown out of your own Catherine stage. The second prompt was to read some of Austen's shorter or unfinished works. So I followed along with the group read of her Juvenilia, some of which came from this edition, some of which came from my Penguin edition or other books around the house. But that was also really enjoyable. I didn't enjoy them as much as I love reading her finished works, but let's face it, there's a reason that these were not published until later, because she probably felt they weren't her best work either. You can definitely see the youthful playfulness, and that was fun, but after a while it wore on me a little bit. The next prompt was to read a work from Austen's lifetime. I usually fudge this a little bit and make it something that could have influenced Austen's writing. So this year I read Fantomina, or Love in a Maze by Eliza Haywood, who was a major novelist and playwright earlier in the 18th century. And I think we know that Austen read her and liked her, or at least referenced her often, and I could really see why in this novel. This is a novel about a young woman who falls in love with this very fickle, very womanizing aristocratic man. And so over the course of the novel, she assumes several different disguises to try and win him over. It is extremely short. I read it through in a couple of hours, but I loved the playfulness of it and how very rebellious it was, considering how we tend to think of the past as extremely decorous, extremely proper. This is not at all. It borders on the sexually explicit, actually, which I found incredible and was a lot of fun, and you can definitely see that kind of playfulness, especially in Austen's earlier work, but in her wit in general as well. The next prompt was to read some non-fiction, either about Austen or the Regency world that she lived in. For this, I have a bunch of different reads. The first of which was Be More Jane by Sophie Andrews. I received this in the latest Regency Marketplace box, and I've been following Sophie on Instagram under the heading Laughing with Lizzie for a few months now, because I was introduced to her through the What the Austen podcast. And this is one of 2 books that she's written. This one is pulling out life lessons that you can learn from Jane Austen's characters or just her works and her life in general. And it's very cute, it's very simple. There are fun little interludes where she pretends to be a variety of characters and give you advice in the style of that character, which is also quite fun. And yeah, it was a lovely way to kick off the month. Then I also read through Jane Austen in Bath by Catherine Reeve, which gives you 5 different walking routes that you can take throughout the city of Bath, where Austen lived herself for a time, and where pieces of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion are set, and where I lived for a time. So she gives you 5 walking routes to try and tells you about various significant points along the way that influenced either Austen herself or the novels that she wrote. And it was fun. Again, it's very short. There isn't a whole lot to it, but I did enjoy reading about a lot of the places that she mentioned, as well as seeing illustrations of what various parts would have looked like at the time when Austen lived there. Then I also read through Martha Lloyd's household book, which was edited by Julian Guerrer and Deirdre LaFay, and this was really quite cool. So Martha Lloyd was one of Jane Austen's dear friends, and she lived with Jane and her sister and their mother for a time in Chawton Cottage as well. So this is Martha Lloyd's household book. So it was a book of recipes for both food and household products that these women would have needed. And Julian Guerra not only gives you a really great biography of Martha in the front, which is wonderful because we don't often hear about her in comparison to Jane Austen, and then facsimiles of the actual household book, followed by a typewritten transcript in the back. So I read through this, started digging for recipes that I could potentially use in one of my videos. However, the measurements were a little bit off. It was rather difficult to tell, and I discovered that in this book, which I already had, the Jane Austen cookbook, Maggie Black and Deirdre LaFay take recipes that they found in Martha Lloyd's household book and not only typewrite them, but rewrite them in the standard format for recipes that we are used to seeing today, with genuine measurements and more step-by-step instructions. So using those two items together, I was able to piece together the Regency-esque cooking video that you will have seen by now. And finally, in the nonfiction category, I read The Gentleman's Daughter by Amanda Vickery. And this is exploring what middle-class women's lives would have been like in Georgian England by looking at primary sources from, I think, 8 different women. It sounds fascinating. It is very important. I think all of the points that she was making are very important, mainly that we cannot assume that people lived by the same rules that the elite did that we hear about, nor can we assume that the very, very poor would have tried to live by these same standards. Everything is all relative. However, the main sticking point for me was the way that it was written. It is so dense. It is written like this was her thesis that she expanded upon and published, which she may very well have done, but it did make for very slow reading. Plus, this is the new edition from Yale University Press. In this particular edition, the print is tiny, which makes it that much harder to read. So I am glad that I read it. I will probably hang on to it, but it wasn't the wonderfully gripping read that I hoped that it would be. And the last book prompt was to read either a retelling of a Jane Austen novel or historical fiction set in the Regency period. And for that prompt, I have read 5 books, 2 physical and 3 digital. The 2 physical books that I read were first The Late Mrs. Willoughby by Claudia Gray. This is the sequel to The Murder of Mr. Wickham, and this I actually enjoyed a little bit better than The Murder of Mr. Wickham, purely because it narrowed its focus a little bit to focus on the characters from just one of Austen's novels. I will say I did spot who did it fairly on. I just couldn't figure out how exactly or why he did it. I couldn't figure out how all of the pieces fit together. And I am really loving how Claudia Gray is portraying Juliet Tilney and Jonathan Darcy. And I'm wondering if the next novels in this series, because it is hinted that there will be more, if they will also focus on another of Austen's novels. And I'm wondering how these 2 main characters will end up in those spots. For this novel, Juliet Tilney is invited to visit Marianne since they became great friends in the last novel, And Jonathan Darcy is invited to visit Mr. Willoughby along with a few other school friends, even though Jonathan does not want to go because Willoughby was his bully at school. But his parents feel that it would be advantageous for him to go, so he goes. And they end up being in the same neighborhood, and Sophia, now Mrs. Willoughby, ends up dead. And Juliet and Jonathan once again must team up together in secret to try and figure out who killed her. I also read Captain Wentworth's Diary by Amanda Grange. This is part of a whole series that she did where she rewrote each of Austen's novels from the perspective of all of their heroes. I read this in the hopes that it would give me a little bit more clarity on Captain Wentworth, because I will admit he is not my favorite as a hero. And this helped a little bit. I still hold to my same objections, which are that he is unnecessarily cruel to Anne at the beginning of Persuasion, which does not endear me to him. I would not want him back after that. However, what I did like about this one is that it gives you a glimpse into what their early courtship and that broken engagement might have been like. And then the second 2/3 take place within the confines of Persuasion itself. So that was quite fun, and I am glad that I read it. Then I had 2 arcs that luckily fell into Regency fiction, so I read those as well. The first was Jane and the Final Mystery by Stephanie Barron, and this is, as the name suggests, the last book in her Jane Austen Mysteries series, which really saddened me going into it. Jane is now in Winchester at this point. Her health is failing. We know things are not going to go well. But one of her nephew's school friends is accused of murder when another boy at school ends up drowned in the river. And so she and Edward, I think his name is, end up teaming up again on the sly to try and prove him innocent and find out who did kill this boy instead. That mystery was very good. I did like that it highlighted the really brutal nature of boys' schools, even the highly respected ones, that carried through the 20th century, from what I understand. But given how emotional I found the last novel, the penultimate novel, this one seemed very detached in terms of the fact that, as any Austenite knows, we know that Austen is going to die. We know that she died in Winchester. So I didn't get that emotional gut punch, which part of me is grateful for, but the other part of me is slightly confused by. The other arc I had was A Lady's Guide to Scandal by Sophie Irwin, which is her second Regency novel. This one follows a young widow. She was unhappily married, and now at 27 her husband has died, and she will inherit a large portion of his estate and thus a lot of money, but only if she keeps an impeccable reputation. And so she moves to Bath to try and get away from all of his prying relatives and her overbearing parents. And then one of the most scandalous men keeps running into her in Bath. And she finds that she likes him more and more, but this is definitely a problem for her keeping her wealth. Plus, the young man that she was in love with before she married her first husband is now also back from the Navy. I really enjoyed this one. I loved how it looked at so many different things. I loved the Persuasion-esque storyline going on. I loved the rakish storyline. I loved how it looked very subtly at things like what it would have been like to be a person of color in Regency society, especially high Regency society, problems with the beginnings of empire, same-sex relationships, widowhood, feminism, the art scene in the Regency period, all of these things came together and it was just so wonderfully done. I actually enjoyed it more than her first novel, which I read last year for Jane Austen July. And then lastly, I listened to the Audible production of Mrs. Wickham. And I forget the name of the playwright, but I will have the image over here and hopefully it will have her name. But this is more an audio play than an audio book, which I really enjoyed. It is mainly acted by Jessie Buckley, who plays Lydia, now Mrs. Wickham, and Johnny Flynn playing Mr. Wickham. And it follows them in the aftermath of their marriage, gives you a little bit more about how she was lured into it, and gives Lydia the opportunity to tell her side of the story and to redeem herself a bit. It starts out very bleak, very dark, very rock and roll rebellious, and I wasn't sure what to think of it. But as the story went forward, I liked it more and more. There were probably a few anachronisms going on, but I was willing to ignore that for the sake of exploring the character development. I don't know that these characters could be redeemed the way that she wants them to be in this adaptation. I don't know that that works for Pride and Prejudice, but I do think it provides a very interesting parallel for how to look at people like this today. I then also read 3 other books this month for other reasons. First of all, for Ruby Granger's book club on Fable, I read The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, or rather I reread it because I did read it in high school. This is a story that I don't love, and I don't think you're supposed to love it. Certainly not for the people, because they are all horrible people. But I had forgotten how beautifully written it is. And I think from a certain viewpoint, it is beautiful in its tragedy. But I certainly would not look at it as this great sweeping love story, or that you're supposed to aspire to be any of these people. The reason why I have a huge problem with all of these Great Gatsby themed parties these days. You are not meant to be Gatsby. It did not work out for him. But anyway, I am glad I reread it, and I will definitely be hanging on to this vintage edition because it is beautiful. Then, as I mentioned in my June wrap-up, I had started reading Mad About Shakespeare by Jonathan Bate, and indeed I finished it in the very beginnings of July. And it is indeed a 5-star read from me. It is just a love letter to literature, especially classic literature and poetry, and how it has helped him throughout the course of his life, about the amazing teachers and the impact that they had and that the literature they were teaching had on him at the time. And it's really a plea to bring some of that fun and that pleasure and those classic works back into the classroom, which he says outright in his acknowledgments as well, which I think is extremely brave, but very needed. And yes, I will be hanging on to this forever. And then finally, I read For Adelaide by Sarah Balaka, who you may remember if you watched my most recent book haul, is a former student, and she gave to me and to Veronica, the French teacher, who was more her teacher than I was. But she gave both of us the manuscript of a novel that she's writing, and so I read through it during the early parts of July. So I have nothing to hold up. I have no photo, no publishing information, because that is probably further down the line. But if anything happens with it, I will definitely let you know, because I did really enjoy it. It is at this stage a Victorian love story, but with gothic, slightly magical elements lurking underneath and really pulling at a lot of the plot points. And I don't want to say more than that in case it goes through major changes before it is published. But like I said, if anything more happens with that book, I will let you know. And there you have it. Those were the books that I was able to read for Jane Austen July, which I think is very impressive given my earlier reading record. And I really hope that this trend continues into August as well, because it's making me feel so good to be able to read this much. Let me know down below what were some of your favorite reads for Jane Austen July, or if you have further questions or opinions about any of the books that I mentioned, let me know as well. I always love talking to you all. And until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.